Processed food looks cheap, but it's the most expensive food you can buy. You pay once at the store, and then you keep paying. With your energy, with your focus, with your health, with your independence. The real cost of food doesn't show up on the receipt, it shows up years later. I want to begin somewhere simple, because simplicity is where we lost our way. I want to begin not in a laboratory, not in a supermarket aisle filled with fluorescent light and promises printed on cardboard boxes, but at a table, a real table. One that has been worn smooth by years of elbows, conversation, and meals that meant something beyond calories. For most of human history, food was not confusing. It was not ideological. It was not marketed. It was part of life in the same way breathing was part of life. You ate what your land could grow, what your culture knew how to prepare, and what your body recognized as nourishment. Food was memory, it was ritual, it was relationship. And then slowly, almost politely at first, food became something else. It became a product. When food became a product, we stopped asking the most important question an eater can ask: what is this? Instead, we were trained to ask, what does this promise? Lower fat, higher protein, added fiber, fortified, enhanced, improved way. Words designed to soothe our anxiety while disconnecting us further from the reality of what we were putting into our bodies. Here's a quiet truth I've come to believe after decades of watching this transformation. The more a society industrializes its food, the more it must industrialize its healthcare. This is not a moral judgment. It's a systems observation. When we replace real food with food-like substances, the bill always arrives later, in doctors' offices, pharmacies, and lost years of vitality. And this is where food quietly intersects with freedom, because freedom is not only political or financial. Freedom is also metabolic. It's the ability to move through your life with energy, clarity, and resilience. It's the ability to age without becoming dependent earlier than necessary. It's the ability to make choices without being managed by blood sugar spikes, cravings engineered by food scientists, or chronic conditions that didn't need to exist. Most people don't realize how expensive modern eating is, not at the checkout counter, but over a lifetime. Highly processed food often looks cheap, but cheap calories are the most expensive calories you can buy. They cost you twice. Once when you purchase them and again when you pay for the consequences. Medical bills, missed work, fatigue, reduced focus, shortened health span. There's a principle I often return to, and I'll say it here in my own words. Pay farmers now or pay doctors later. One supports life, the other manages decline. Our grandparents didn't need food rules because they lived inside food cultures. They knew how to eat because everyone around them knew how to eat. Knowledge was passed down not through articles or podcasts, but through repetition, through watching, through doing. You learn to eat by eating with others. Today, many of us eat alone, quickly, distracted, and confused. We eat standing up. We eat in cars. We eat while staring at screens that never ask us how we feel afterward. And then we wonder why eating no longer nourishes us. Here's the paradox of modern food. We have more information than ever and less wisdom than ever. Information tells you what a nutrient does in isolation. Wisdom tells you how food fits into a life. This is why I've always resisted complicated diets. Complexity benefits industries, not eaters. When food rules become so elaborate that you need an app, a calculator, or constant willpower, you are no longer eating. You are managing. And management is exhausting. True nourishment simplifies your life. It does not complicate it. There's a financial lesson hiding here, and it's a profound one. Simplicity compounds, complexity leaks. This is true in investing, in health, and in living. The more systems you need to maintain equilibrium, the more fragile your life becomes. Real food is anti-fragile. It doesn't require instruction manuals. It doesn't break when trends change. It doesn't need constant reformulation. Plants, animals, traditions, time. When you center your diet on foods that your great-grandmother would recognize, you're not just making a nutritional decision. You're making an economic one. You're choosing lower long-term costs, fewer interventions. Less dependence. This is not about perfection. Perfection is another modern obsession that sells well and serves poorly. This is about direction, about returning to a pattern that worked for far longer than our current experiment. Let me put it this way. Every culture that thrived figured out how to eat before it figured out how to market. We've reversed the order, And now we're trying to eat our way out of the confusion marketing created. Food companies sell certainty. Real food offers trust. And trust is what allows you to relax, to stop obsessing, to stop fighting your own body. When you trust your food, your body stops sending emergency signals. Hunger normalizes. Satisfaction returns. Meals end naturally. This alone is a form of freedom most people have forgotten exists. I often say, paraphrased here, that the secret to eating well is not restraint, it's attention. When you pay attention to what you eat, how it tastes, how it makes you feel, and where it came from, behavior adjusts without force. This is true financially as well. Awareness changes spending faster than restriction. When you understand long-term cost, short-term temptation loses power. Food that nourishes costs less over time because it preserves the asset you live inside, your body, and your body is your first economy. If you neglect it, every other form of wealth becomes harder to enjoy. If you protect it, options expand, energy increases, focus sharpens, life widens. This is why eating is never just personal. It's cultural, it's economic, it's political in the deepest sense, not partisan but structural. It determines what systems grow and which ones fade. When you choose real food, you support soil instead of factories, farmers instead of chemists, communities instead of algorithms. And over time, those choices echo back to you in the form of resilience. In the next part, I want to talk about how rules, simple ones, are not constraints, but relief. How boundaries liberate us from decision fatigue. How knowing what not to eat can be more powerful than obsessing over what you should. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. Every meal is either an investment in vitality or a withdrawal from it. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be consistent. Let me talk now about rules, because the word itself has been misunderstood. Rules sound rigid. They sound moralistic. They sound like discipline imposed from the outside. But the rules that govern eating well were never meant to feel like punishment. They were meant to feel like relief. Rules, when they are simple and humane, exist to free us from constant decision-making. They reduce anxiety. They create rhythm. They allow instinct to return. Think about how exhausting modern eating has become. Every trip to the grocery store feels like a test you didn't study for. Labels shout at you. Experts contradict one another. One year fat is the enemy. The next year sugar, then carbohydrates, then gluten, and then something else. The result is not better health. It's confusion. Confusion is profitable. Simplicity is not. When rules disappear, corporations step in to replace them with marketing. And marketing doesn't ask what's good for you. It asks what will sell. This is why the most innovative foods are often the least nourishing. They exist to create novelty, not sustenance. Here's a quiet truth worth remembering. People don't overeat because they are weak. They overeat because they are disoriented. When you no longer know what a proper meal looks like, everything becomes a snack and nothing feels satisfying. Traditional food cultures solve this problem elegantly. They didn't count calories, they didn't track macros, they didn't moralize eating. They used patterns. Meals had structure, portions had meaning, food had context. This is why rules matter. Not complex rules, not scientific rules. Cultural rules. Rules like eating mostly foods that come from plants. Rules like stopping before you're stuffed. Rules like treating sweets as treats, not staples. These aren't commandments, they're accumulated wisdom tested by time rather than trials. There's a financial lesson here that's hard to ignore. Cultures that ate this way also spent less on healthcare. Not because they were healthier by accident, but because their daily habits prevented chronic illness from taking root. Prevention is the most undervalued investment in modern society. We spend enormous sums reacting to problems that could have been softened, delayed, or avoided entirely by small, consistent choices. This applies to money as much as it applies to health. Small daily habits shape long-term outcomes far more reliably than dramatic interventions. Eating well is not about heroism, it's about habit, and habit once formed costs very little energy to maintain. This is why food rules work when diets fail. Diets rely on willpower. Rules rely on structure. Willpower exhausts. Structure supports. I often tell people in essence that if a food has more than 5 ingredients, especially ingredients you can't pronounce, it's probably not food. This isn't chemistry snobbery, it's a shortcut. a way to bypass the noise and return to common sense. Shortcuts matter. Life is complicated enough. The more decisions you outsource to wisdom, the more energy you retain for living. This is a form of wealth most people don't account for, cognitive wealth. The less mental bandwidth you waste managing food confusion, the more clarity you have for work, relationships, creativity, and rest. This is freedom in a very real sense. Another principle worth reflecting on is this: tradition is often a record of solutions, not stubbornness. When a culture eats a certain way for hundreds of years, it's not random, it's adaptive. It worked. People survived, people thrived. Modern nutrition often dismisses tradition as unscientific, but science itself is slow to capture complexity. Food doesn't act in isolation. Meals matter more than nutrients. Patterns matter more than components. This is why eating real meals at real times with real people does more for health than any supplement ever could. Meals slow us down. They create beginnings and endings. They tell the body when enough is enough. They restore a sense of proportion. Snacking, by contrast, erases boundaries. It turns eating into a background activity. And when eating has no boundaries, it has no satisfaction. Satisfaction is crucial. Without it, we keep eating in search of something we never quite find. From a financial standpoint, dissatisfaction is costly. It drives consumption. It fuels impulse buying. It keeps us chasing more instead of enjoying enough. Food teaches us this lesson daily if we pay attention. When you eat something deeply nourishing, you stop thinking about food. When you eat something engineered, you keep reaching. The same is true in life. Rules help us recognize enough. One of the most liberating food rules is also one of the oldest. Eat until you are satisfied, not until you are full. Satisfaction is subtle. Fullness is blunt. One listens, the other overwhelms. Listening is a skill we've lost. Listening to hunger. Listening to satiety, listening to energy levels, listening to how food makes us feel hours later, not just minutes later. This attentiveness restores trust between body and mind, and trust is what eliminates the need for control. Control is expensive. Trust is efficient. In financial life, people who trust systems they understand make calmer decisions. People who don't trust their systems micromanage, panic, and overcorrect. Eating is no different. When you trust your food, you stop negotiating with yourself at every meal. You stop swinging between restriction and indulgence. You find a middle ground that doesn't require constant supervision. This middle ground is where health quietly accumulates. And health, unlike money, compounds invisibly until suddenly it doesn't. You only notice its absence. One of the greatest gifts you can give your future self is reducing the number of crises they'll have to manage. Eating well is crisis prevention disguised as daily life. In the next part, I want to talk about how the modern food environment actively works against these simple rules and how learning to navigate supermarkets, restaurants, and social situations with grace, not rigidity, restores agency. But for now, consider this. Rules don't limit freedom when they align with human nature. They protect it. And the best rules feel less like discipline and more like remembering something you once knew. At some point, eating stopped happening in kitchens and fields and began happening in boardrooms. Decisions about what we eat were no longer made primarily by cooks, farmers, or families, but by marketers, chemists, and engineers. And this shift explains much of the confusion we feel today when we try to eat well inside a modern food environment that was never designed for our long-term health. The supermarket is not neutral. It looks democratic, abundant, and welcoming, but it is a carefully engineered landscape. Every shelf, every package, every color and claim exists to guide your attention and influence your choice. The most profitable foods are rarely placed where your body would naturally look for nourishment. They are placed where your eyes linger longest and your willpower is weakest. This is not a conspiracy. It's an incentive structure. Highly processed food is profitable because it is cheap to make, easy to store, endlessly tweakable, and habit-forming. Real food, by contrast, spoils. It resists branding. It doesn't shout, it simply exists. And because it exists quietly, it often requires intention to choose. Intention, however, is a muscle. And like any muscle, it grows stronger with use. One of the most powerful skills an eater can develop is learning how to see the food environment clearly, without resentment or paranoia. The goal is not to fight the system at every turn, but to understand it well enough that it loses its power over you. Here's a simple observation that can change how you shop forever. The perimeter of the grocery store looks like food. The center often looks like products. Fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, dairy, grains. These are recognizable. They don't need mascots or slogans. They don't promise transformation. They promise nourishment. The inner aisles, by contrast, sell solutions. Solutions to time, solutions to boredom, solutions to stress. Solutions to hunger that don't quite satisfy it. This is where many people lose, not because they lack discipline, but because they lack a map. Maps reduce anxiety. They turn chaos into terrain. Once you know where you are, you can choose where to go. There's a deep financial parallel here. People who struggle with money often feel overwhelmed, not because money is inherently complex, but because they don't understand the environment they're navigating. Confusion breeds avoidance. Avoidance breeds costly mistakes. Clarity restores agency. When you understand that most packaged food is designed to be overconsumed, not nourishing, you stop blaming yourself for cravings that were engineered. You also stop negotiating endlessly with products that were never meant to be negotiated with in the first place. You don't debate with soda. You don't argue with candy. You simply recognize them for what they are. Occasional pleasures, not daily fuel. This shift removes a tremendous amount of internal friction. Another challenge of modern eating is speed. We live in a culture that treats time as something to be minimized, even in activities meant to sane us. Fast food is not just about convenience. It's about a worldview that sees eating as an interruption rather than a foundation. But eating quickly doesn't actually save time. It often costs time later in digestion issues, fatigue, and dissatisfaction that leads to more eating. Slowness is not inefficiency. It's alignment. Eating slowly restores proportion. It allows taste to register. It gives the body time to signal satiety. And it reconnects eating with pleasure instead of compulsion. Pleasure matters more than we've been taught to admit. When pleasure is absent, consumption escalates. When pleasure is present, restraint becomes natural. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about food and about life more broadly. Deprivation breeds obsession. Enjoyment breeds sufficiency. This principle extends beyond the table. People who allow themselves modest, regular pleasures tend to make better long-term decisions than those who oscillate between denial and excess. This is true in spending, investing, working, and resting. Balance is not the absence of indulgence, it's the presence of proportion. Another modern obstacle is eating alone. Not occasionally, but habitually. When meals lose their social dimension, they lose their boundaries. Eating becomes something we do while doing something else. The body notices, even if the mind doesn't. Shared meals slow us down. They create natural pauses. They remind us that eating is not just about fueling a body, but participating in a culture. Cultures that eat together tend to eat better, not because they try harder, but because the structure itself supports better choices. Portions moderate. Rituals replace impulses. Food has a beginning and an end. This structure is deeply protective. From a financial perspective, communal habits often protect against extremes. People who share meals often share knowledge, resources, and perspective. Isolation, whether nutritional or financial, tends to amplify poor decisions. One of the quiet tragedies of modern life is how often we eat in ways that require constant self-control. Self-control is finite. It was never meant to be the primary mechanism of nourishment. The best food rules are not those that demand heroism, but those that make the healthy choice the easy one. This is why environment matters more than intention. Arrange your environment well, and behavior follows with little resistance. This is also why learning to cook, even simply, is such a radical act in modern life. Cooking restores agency. It turns you from a consumer back into a participant. It reconnects you with ingredients, time, and consequence. Cooking doesn't have to be elaborate. It just has to be real. People who cook tend to eat better, not because they are morally superior, but because cooking naturally favors whole ingredients. It introduces effort, which introduces selectivity. It invites planning, which reduces impulse, and here's an underappreciated financial benefit. Cooking is one of the most reliable ways to reduce long-term expenses while increasing quality of life. It saves money up front and saves health later. Very few habits offer that kind of double return. When you cook, you also reclaim time in a strange way. Yes, it takes minutes, but it gives back hours in energy, focus, and reduced stress. It anchors the day. This is why so many people find that improving how they eat unexpectedly improves how they live. The modern food environment is not going to change overnight. But you don't need it to. You only need a small pocket of clarity within it. A set of guiding principles that travel with you into stores, restaurants, workplaces, and celebrations. In the next part, I want to talk about how moderation, not restriction, is the real skill of a healthy eater, and how learning to enjoy treats without turning them into habits is one of the most liberating competencies you can develop. For now, remember this. You don't need to fight the food system to eat well. You just need to understand it well enough to stop being confused by it. And clarity, once gained, tends to spread quietly into every other part of life. Moderation is one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern life. We often imagine it as deprivation wearing polite clothes, as a constant act of restraint that drains joy from eating and discipline from living. But true moderation is not about saying no all the time. It's about knowing when yes is enough. For most of human history, moderation was not something people had to think about. It was built into the rhythm of life. Sweets appeared rarely. Meat was precious. Feast days existed precisely because ordinary days were simpler. Pleasure was concentrated, not continuous. Today, pleasure is everywhere, and because it's everywhere, it's strangely unsatisfying. When everything is allowed all the time, nothing feels special. When treats become habits, they stop being treats. And when eating loses its sense of occasion, it becomes something we do compulsively rather than consciously. Here's a principle worth sitting with. Pleasure is strongest when it has edges. Without boundaries, pleasure dissolves into noise. Moderation restores those edges. This is why one of the most powerful food rules is also one of the gentlest. Enjoy treats, but don't let them become daily rituals. This isn't a nutritional rule as much as it's a psychological one. It preserves delight. It protects satisfaction. And satisfaction is what keeps appetite from running endlessly forward. Think about how this plays out financially. People who allow themselves occasional, intentional indulgences often spend less overall than those who deny themselves until they break. Deprivation leads to binge behavior with food, money, work, even rest. Balance is not about perfection. It's about sustainability. When you remove moral judgment from food, something remarkable happens. You stop oscillating between a good and a bad. You start paying attention instead. And attention naturally guides you toward moderation without force. This is why I've always believed that how you eat matters more than what you eat. Eating with awareness slows you down. It gives pleasure time to register. It allows fullness to arrive before excess. Eating while distracted, by contrast, invites overeating without enjoyment. You get the calories without the pleasure, which is the worst possible deal. The modern world is filled with these bad bargains. Moderation also teaches patience. When you know you can enjoy something later, urgency fades. Scarcity mentality disappears. You stop grasping. This calm carries over into other parts of life. People who practice moderation with food often find themselves more patient with money, relationships, and time. They no longer feel compelled to maximize every moment. They understand that enough is powerful. Enough is liberating. One of the quiet tragedies of modern abundance is that it has eroded our ability to recognize enough. More food, more options, more information, more stimulation, and yet less satisfaction. Moderation reintroduces proportion into abundance. It's not about less. It's about right-sized. There's also a cultural dimension here that matters deeply. Many traditional cuisines include rich foods, fats, starches, sweets, but they're eaten within a context of balance. Portion, frequency, and ritual do the regulating, not guilt, not willpower. When we import foods without importing the context that govern them, imbalance follows. This is why borrowing diets from other cultures rarely works. What works is borrowing patterns, meals instead of grazing, celebration instead of constant indulgence, variety over time instead of excess at once. From a health perspective, this protects metabolism. From a financial perspective, it protects budgets. From a psychological perspective, it protects peace. Peace is often overlooked as an outcome of good eating, but it shouldn't be. When food stops being a battleground, mental space opens. You stop thinking about food constantly. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop carrying quiet shame into meals. That mental space is valuable. It allows focus to return to things that matter more than calories. Another overlooked benefit of moderation is longevity. Not just lifespan, but health span. Many of the chronic conditions that burden modern societies are not caused by acute excess, but by small daily imbalances repeated for years. Moderation smooths the curve. It reduces wear and tear. It keeps systems flexible. Flexibility is a form of resilience. Resilient bodies adapt. Resilient finances adapt. Rigid systems break under pressure. This is why extreme diets often fail spectacularly. They create rigidity. They demand constant vigilance, and eventually something gives. Moderation bends instead of breaks. There's also a social generosity embedded in moderation. When you're not fixated on optimizing your own intake, you're more available to others. You can share meals without anxiety. You can accept hospitality. You can participate without performing. Food becomes connective again. This matters more than we often admit. Humans evolved to eat together. Isolation at the table has consequences. Emotional, cultural, even biological. Shared meals regulate pace. They provide cues. They ground us. Grounded people make better decisions. One of the most practical ways to practice moderation is to return meals to the center of eating, not snacks, not constant grazing. Meals. Meals create structure. They create beginnings and endings. They remind the body that nourishment comes in waves, not drips. Structure reduces stress. And stress, as we know, is one of the most expensive forces in modern life, financially and physiologically. When you eat with moderation, stress hormones quiet. Digestion improves, sleep deepens, energy stabilizes, and with stable energy comes clearer thinking. Clear thinking is a kind of wealth. In the next part, I want to explore how eating less, but better, is not about restriction, but about quality, and how prioritizing quality over quantity transforms not just health, but how we value things across life. But for now, consider this. Moderation is not about denying yourself pleasure. It's about protecting it. And pleasure, when protected, becomes a renewable resource instead of a diminishing one. There comes a moment, if you pay attention long enough, when you realize that eating less is not about subtraction. It's about substitution. It's not about taking pleasure away. It's about upgrading it. For decades, we were taught to focus on quantity, calories, grams, portions, as though eating were an accounting problem. But human satisfaction doesn't work that way. We don't eat numbers, we eat experiences. And when the experience is thin, we keep eating in search of something that never arrives. Quality changes that equation entirely. When food is genuinely good, when it's fresh, well-prepared, thoughtfully sourced, the body recognizes it quickly. Satisfaction arrives sooner. Appetite calms. Meals end naturally. You don't need rules to stop. You want to stop. This is one of the quiet miracles of eating well. Better food asks less of you. It doesn't demand discipline. It invites attention. This is why cultures that prioritize quality almost always eat less without trying. They spend more care on ingredients, preparation, and occasion, and as a result, quantity regulates itself. The meal feels complete, even if it's modest. There's a deep financial analogy here. People who invest in quality tend to replace things less often. They buy fewer items, but they keep them longer. The initial cost may be higher, but the long-term cost is lower. Quality reduces churn. The same is true with food. When you eat cheap, highly processed calories, you pay repeatedly, in hunger, in cravings, in fatigue. When you eat real food, you pay once and move on with your day. Eating less but better is not elitism, it's efficiency. One of the most misunderstood ideas in modern nutrition is abundance. We assume that more food equals more security. But real security comes from knowing that when you eat, you will be nourished. That certainty reduces the impulse to stockpile calories. Scarcity thinking leads to excess. Sufficiency leads to calm. This is why learning to cook a few simple, satisfying dishes can change everything. You don't need 100 recipes. You need a handful you enjoy deeply. Repetition builds mastery, builds pleasure. Pleasure builds restraint. Restraint that emerges from pleasure is effortless. Restraint that emerges from fear is brittle. Quality also reorients our relationship with animals, plants, and land. When food is anonymous, it's easy to consume without thought. When food has a story, a farm, a season, a person who grew or prepared it, consumption slows. Respect enters the equation. Respect is a regulating force. From a health perspective, this reduces overeating. From an ethical perspective, it reduces waste. From a financial perspective, it encourages intention instead of impulse. Waste, after all, is one of the hidden costs of modern abundance. We buy more than we need because food is cheap and disposable, and then we throw it away. Not just money, but energy, labor, water, and soil embedded in it. Eating less but better aligns consumption with value. This alignment spreads. People who learn to value food properly often begin valuing other things differently too. They become less interested in constant novelty, less seduced by volume, more attuned to craftsmanship. This shift has consequences far beyond the kitchen. There's also a temporal dimension to quality that we rarely discuss. Good food takes time, not necessarily hours, but presence. It asks you to slow down enough to notice, and in slowing down, you regain time in another form. Clarity. Rushed eating creates restless days. Calm meals create calmer minds. Calm minds make better decisions. They spend more wisely. They invest more patiently. They react less impulsively. Over time, these small differences compound. One of the greatest misunderstandings of modern life is the belief that speed equals efficiency. In food, speed often produces the opposite. Fast food saves minutes and costs hours later in sluggishness, distraction, and dissatisfaction. Eating better often means eating more slowly, even if preparation is simple. That slowness pays dividends immediately. Another aspect of quality is seasonality. When you eat what's in season, variety happens naturally over time. You don't need constant choice at every meal. Nature rotates the menu for you. Seasonality introduces anticipation. It teaches patience. It reminds us that not everything must be available all the time. This lesson is deeply countercultural and deeply stabilizing. People who accept seasonality tend to be more content. They enjoy things when they arrive and let them go when they pass. They don't demand permanence from temporary pleasures. That acceptance is a form of maturity, and maturity is closely tied to financial freedom. People who can delay gratification, who can wait without anxiety, who can enjoy things without clinging, these people tend to do better across life domains. It is risk management at the most personal level. There is also a moral humility embedded in simple food rules that I find deeply reassuring. They don't promise optimization. They don't claim perfection. They accept that life is messy, that pleasure matters, that celebration has a place. So they ask only that we pay attention, respect limits, and remember that our bodies are not machines to be hacked, but living systems to be supported. This perspective restores dignity to eating. And dignity, once restored, tends to spread outward. You begin to see meals not as interruptions, but as punctuation. Moments that structure the day. Moments that invite pause. Moments that remind you that life is not meant to be consumed endlessly, but experienced fully. There is a quiet resistance in this way of eating, a refusal to be rushed, a refusal to be optimized beyond recognition. A refusal to hand over responsibility for your health to systems that profit from confusion. This resistance is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It's practiced privately 3 times a day with fork and knife and attention. And over years, it accumulates. People sometimes ask whether eating well is worth the effort. My answer is always the same. It doesn't add effort. It redistributes it. You spend a little more care up front and save a great deal of effort later. You trade complexity now for simplicity later. Intention now for resilience later. Attention now for freedom later. That trade is almost always favorable. As I look at the broader picture, I'm convinced that the way we eat shapes not only our bodies but our culture's relationship to limits. A culture that cannot accept limits at the table will struggle to accept limits anywhere else. And limits, properly understood, are not enemies of freedom. They are its precondition. A river without banks is a flood. Pleasure without boundaries is compulsion. Choice without context is paralysis. Food rules, at their best, provide banks. They give shape. They allow energy to flow without destruction. This is why they endure. You don't need to follow them perfectly. Perfection is another modern trap. You need only return to them often enough that they begin to feel familiar. Familiarity breeds trust. Trust reduces fear. Fear is expensive. A life with fewer unnecessary fears is a richer life, regardless of income. So if I were to leave you with one final thought, it would be this: eat in a way that supports the life you want to live decades from now. Not just the body you want to have, but the freedom you want to preserve. Eat in a way that keeps your future options open. Eat in a way that honors pleasure without being ruled by it. Eat in a way that costs a little attention now so it doesn't cost you independence later. Food will never solve every problem, but eaten wisely, it stops creating new ones. And in a world overflowing with unnecessary problems, that alone is a quiet, powerful form of freedom.